IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi, and today we are going to discuss the joint statement issued after the state visit of PM Modi to the US, the joint US-India statement. And there have been a lot of significant developments, especially regarding the technological and strategic cooperation between India and the US. So we'll talk to our experts about these developments, ask their opinion on what do these imply, how significant they are, and how ready the Indian regulatory ecosystem, the private players, and the government, everyone is to take advantage of these developments and announcements. And so, first, I have with me my colleague Pranay, who will discuss regarding the announcements on the semiconductor sector. Then, I have with me my colleague Bharat, who will discuss the announcements regarding the advanced telecommunications sector. And then we would hear from Aditya, my colleague, who will talk about the developments in the space sector. And then we'll just have this discussion. So let's begin. Hi, Pranay. So given that there has been a lot of exciting announcements on the semiconductor sector, give us a brief rundown of what was announced and what are the possible implications.
Hi, Saurabh. So, yes, indeed, strengthening semiconductor supply chains was the first topic mentioned in the fact sheet, which was released by the White House. And there are three things which have been mentioned, and I think all three are pretty important from an Indian perspective. So, first one is that Micron Technology, which is a well-known manufacturer of memory chips, they are going to start their assembly and test facility in India, in Gujarat. So this is an important move because this will be the first ever approved plan by the India Semiconductor Mission. So as you know, earlier there were a lot of talks about some fabs which were going to begin, but none of the fabs had gotten approval from India Semiconductor Mission, which is the implementing body for fabs and for assembly plants of the government of India. So none of them were actually in motion, and many of those have been asked to reapply. So this was the first one which has received approval of the Indian government. So it's not just a tentative thing, it's pretty much a settled thing. And it is an assembly plant, so it does not mean that chips will be manufactured here, but what it will mean is that wafers will be imported. Those wafers have dies, which are basically unpackaged chips. So those dies are cut, the wafer is cut, those dies are then assembled, they are tested, and they are packaged. So that kind of work will start happening in India, and they have said there will be around 5,000 direct jobs which will be generated, etc. So it's a good start. The fact that we have not been able to get any of these facilities yet, and especially someone who has credentials like Micron, that wasn't happening until now. So this is a good start to begin with. The second major thing is that Applied Materials, which is another well-known company in the sector of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, so they have promised to build a center for commercialization and innovation, and that is again good because challenge that Indian companies face is how to commercialize their products. We have enough design engineers, but there is very little Indian intellectual property. So the challenges come at the commercialization stage, and government has been trying to address those things. But it will be good that there is another partner in this with a reputed firm like Applied Materials. And the third part is that Lam Research, another semiconductor manufacturing equipment firm, has announced that it will train 60,000 Indian engineers to accelerate India's semiconductor education and workforce development goals. Again, this is a great thing because we always say human capital is the major leverage India has in the semiconductor supply chain. So the only way this lever can be useful is when there is adequate training, when a large number of people are skilled across the design cycle, and this move will perhaps help in achieving that goal. So this is what was announced, and overall idea is that both the semiconductor industry associations want to build complementary semiconductor ecosystems, which is great news because we don't need to have another TSMC for now. But as long as we have chip manufacturing happening in a trusted ecosystem, it is okay if we do the trailing edge manufacturing in India or assembly in India, and some advanced edge chips are being made in US or Japan. Doesn't matter.
Thanks, Pranay, for that rundown. So, I mean, in this announcement, do you think that what are the possible risk factors? So, these announcements are quite concrete, and then, as you've explained, are pretty useful for India as well. What are the ways that maybe India should be a bit more careful to ensure that we extract the most output and advantage from these three announcements?
Yeah, no, I think the major challenge is just execution, right? So this is announcement, but we have to ensure that this, if Micron project, for example, starts off quickly, starts producing tested chips quickly, that will have a big impact on many things, So what will happen is other technology partners which have not yet shown interest in India will become interested probably, right? So this will have a signaling effect. So execution is really the key. How do we now get the land approvals done? How do we get the facilities up and running? Infrastructure there. All those things will really are the things that we need to focus on. I guess one more thing which is important is to look at our trade policy and our business policy environment. Again, the reason why Taiwanese semiconductor assembly players haven't shown interest in India is because of they have repeatedly told about the business climate. They have told about labor law reforms. For example, in Taiwan, it is common for 12-hour work shifts, which is not common in India. So they have told about that. And then trade also, we have very high import tariffs on a few products, which again impacts a company which is operating at low margin profits. Project ends up becoming uneconomical and uncompetitive. So those were the things which were stopping assembly plants from coming in. So that's why Taiwan didn't come in. But yes, there is a US player which has agreed. Maybe it is also because of the alignment between US and India on larger geopolitical issues. So now the real challenge is to get this on ground and get this working as soon as possible.
Yeah, it seems that way, right? Because I think the geopolitics has made this kind of opportunity possible, which I think maybe both India and USA are gambling on this opportunity. So it is inherent, like India should try to make sure that this kind of experiment is successful so that it enhances the confidence of other players in the field and then the ancillary players, like set up shop in India. So thanks, Pranay, for this rundown. And it will be very exciting to see how these announcements, become more concrete and they're operationalized. And I look forward to talking to you more about how these projects progress.
Thanks, Saurabh.
Hi, Bharat. So, yeah, among many of the different announcements that were made, as part of the India-US joint statement in the fact sheet, there has been an interesting section on advanced telecommunications. So, could you please explain, what are the agreements or the cooperation sectors in this area that India and US have agreed on?
So yeah, thanks, Saurabh. So firstly, it's interesting to see telecommunications here. So the telecom systems actually power a lot of generally our communication networks. It also powers, other infrastructure going forward, like say autonomous vehicles or smart cities or Internet of Things or so many other things. Right? So all of them will be using this underlying infrastructure for its operation. So that makes it kind of important, maybe strategic in a sense. So there are three broad collaboration areas that the announcements have identified. So the first one is on research and development of advanced telecom technologies. Basically, the idea here is that if you see the standard contributors for 5G, Chinese companies rather have almost a one-third share in the total number of contributions that have gone in. So this means that And when you look at the future technologies like 6G, Chinese companies like Huawei have invested a lot of money into R&D, and they have a much bigger lead compared to the other telecom vendors. So when you look at why this is a concern, you see Huawei has close ties to the Chinese government, and a lot of countries around the world have imposed sanctions against it for operating on their networks. So the reasons they state is that there could be possibility of the Chinese government snooping on their conversations, or trade secrets or something like that. So these concerns are one aspect, and to address this, a lot of these vendors have been not allowed to participate on the networks. So now, because of this, you have the next generation of technologies being shaped by these companies, and a lot of these countries want to have an alternative. So if you see US, there's something called the Next G, which is an initiative to get North American companies to take a leadership role in defining these technologies. Europe has something called Hexa-X, which is again a European collaboration to kind of shape the 6G standards. And India has also, I think in March of this year, announced Bharat 6G, which is again trying to do the same things for India. Now, yeah, so this is what is the idea behind it. So everyone wants to have a participation in and representation in defining what goes into those standards, in ensuring that those standards meet the interests of all of these stakeholders. So that's broadly the first area of collaboration. Now, the second area of collaboration was on Open RAN. So before we get into what Open RAN is, let's look at how the telecom market, vendor market is, right? So you have around 4 companies having like almost an 80% market share in the RAN business. So RAN is your mobile towers and the equipment in that part of the network. So 4 companies, so Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung, have almost an 80% market share. That's quite a lot, right? And out of these, now one of the Chinese companies are not being allowed to put their equipment on in most countries. Now, what this means is that the market gets even more concentrated. There is no competition. The prices might go up. Innovation might take a backseat. So all of these are concerns for the operators who are going to be deploying that network, and eventually for the customers also, because they might not have the latest technologies which they could have otherwise. So another factor here is that because of the nature of this industry, there are very high entry barriers. So you need a lot of high skilled tech talent to be able to build these kind of infrastructure. And you also need a lot of investment that goes in. So because of this, these vendors who are operating have deploy like end-to-end systems which have different components in place. Now, these are all tightly coupled, and anyone who is deploying it typically tends to source all the components from one vendor. So now Open RAN, what it does, it disaggregates this entire thing and allows someone to buy different modular components from different vendors and put them together, and they should be able to run it. Now, what this is supposed to allow is that it lowers the entry barriers. Someone with a skill set in doing one particular thing might be able to do that and make a product out of that. And that should seamlessly integrate with the other components from other vendors. And you should be able to build the entire network in this way. So that's about Open RAN. Now, the third area of collaboration was in something which is called the Rip and Replace program. It's a funny name, but and much like how it would hurt when you rip off a bandage, this has also been a painful exercise for some who are affected by this in the US. So what it effectively does is, it was announced, I think, in 2020, and it's a directive for American telecom operators to remove equipment from vendors which does not align with the national security interests. So they have to be removed and replaced with something with trustworthy vendors. So this means that it's an additional cost for a lot of vendors, and it typically is affecting vendors which are smaller, because they are the ones who have opted for low cost equipment from these Chinese vendors, and so they are disproportionately affected. That's one thing. Now, this program had set aside a budget of around $1.9 billion to fund this, but the estimates that have been received from all of these vendors is that it's almost double or triple that amount that has been budgeted. So now, what the announcement yesterday, what that says is that Indian telecom vendors could participate in this rip and replace program, where they would be a trustworthy vendor supplying equipment to replace the Chinese equipment that is there. So these are the three broad areas that of collaboration that have been identified in the telecom space.
Yeah, I mean, Bharat, like that's actually quite substantive and a variety of different areas.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
How prepared do you think, India and Indian vendors, the Indian industry is to take advantage of these, agreements? And are there any potential risks that we need to, address to risks or, like gaps in our regulatory environment or industrial environment that will allow us to more effectively take like benefit from these agreements?
So on the readiness aspect, I think 6G is or future research and development on these future technologies. That is, I think, something that is still in nascent stage in India and also in other countries as well. So what this gives is an opportunity, like even Bharat 6G, it announces, I think, around 10,000 crores for in grants for academic institutions, industries that are working in these areas. And it's supposed to trigger that innovation, get people contributing actively to in standard setting and things like that. So, but it is still in a nascent stage, and this collaboration between India and US might and Europe potentially could help bring a consensus or work together. But the risk here is that there could be a divergence in standards. So, like 5G, you have a universally agreed upon standard, which is defined by the 3GPP, and which is the third generation partnership project, which basically is a collaborative project that of different companies who contribute and come to a consensus on what the standards for that must be. So now, for going forward for 6G, if there is a divergence, that means that there might be different paths that different companies take, different countries and companies take. So that might lead to a loss of interoperability, but that is something I think which people or countries are willing to accept given the current geopolitical climate. Now, with respect to the second area, which is an open RAN. So, like I mentioned, this is you're trying to stitch together different components from different vendors, and there is a certain complexity that comes into the picture because you're taking parts from different things and trying to make them work together, right? So there is complexity that, coming in. There's some security concerns because if you're buying it from one vendor, then you can hold one entity responsible for how it performs the security for that system. All of these things, performance, all of these things is responsible by one entity. Now you have that being distributed and someone else is having to come and integrate all the system together. So, and this is still is not a very mature system right now. So there have been some greenfield deployments in Japan, but not in a more diverse network with other components existing as well. It's a risk, and a lot of, even with the 5G deployments in India, not a lot of operators have opted to have open RAN systems in their networks. So it's still in a process where it is maturing. So maybe that confidence will be built over a period of time. And this announcement has also proposed a kind of a funding support for adoption of this. So maybe that will give the impetus required for quicker adoption of this of ORAN. So once a lot of people adopt it, it will become more stable. There'll be economies of scale involved. So that might make it better for broader adoption. So that's basically the idea behind it. And lastly, I think on rip and replace, it's a good opportunity for Indian telecom vendors who are already deploying in parts of the BSNL network and all of that. So they get an opportunity to find newer markets for their products, and for the US as well, it's a way to source cost-effective components from trustworthy vendors, so to speak. So I think that works for both of these countries.
Thanks, Bharat, for that extensive rundown, and I hope we will discuss this in future when there are concrete developments and something else more exciting happens, and we're able to convert these announcements into more concrete deliverables, and hopefully that would help give fillip to the industry as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. Very interested to see how this plays out. So we'll keep watch.
Hi Aditya. So it seems like a lot of major announcements in the space sector in the aftermath, or I should say, like as a result of the Modi Biden meeting. And it's seemingly very significant announcement, especially regarding the Artemis Accord. So can you please give a rundown on what these announcements are and what are the implications of these?
Sure. Happy to talk about them. I will say that we were at least a bit surprised, especially by the bit about human spaceflight. Artemis, we had some indications already that India was drawing closer because really there were very few material objections really left for India to stay away from Artemis because, India's own space policy is open to, letting the private sector use space resources, for example. And also, a lot of the grand political objections that might, exist to being seen as part of the American camp and so on were also melting away. And finally, India's basically ISRO and NASA have been working together, right? So, for example, on the synthetic aperture radar satellite. And so, there's a greater degree of trust and familiarity now. So there should be less objections to something like Artemis. We also had, for example, NASA Associate Administrator Bhavya Lal coming to India, for example, and making a statement about Artemis. So we had some indications there that might happen, but still, it's quite surprising. These are both significant developments. Just quickly about what Artemis. So Artemis is basically it's a series of basically 10 principles that you sign on to, and those are basically sort of rules of conduct on the moon. And they are associated with the Artemis program. So, there's sort of the prerequisite that you sign on before you become a part of the Artemis program. The Artemis program is, of course, at the center of this American plan to return to the moon. It's not the only part of that plan, but it's the most important part. So, last year we had this Artemis 1 rocket that, it's a human rated capsule, but it was uncrewed and it went around the moon and came back. So next year, we're likely to have a crewed mission, and that crewed mission is going to, again, do this very elliptical orbit around the moon, and they'll probably end up going further from Earth than any humans have ever been before. And perhaps in 2026, perhaps later, we're going to have Artemis 3, which will actually put a couple of people on the moon for a period of about 6 days. And another couple of people will be in orbit around them, and then the 4 of them will join and return back to Earth, hopefully all safe and sound. So, that's the initial leg of Artemis. But really, what Artemis is about is going to the moon to stay. It's about setting up a permanent presence on the moon. In a sense, the US wants to do on the moon what it's kind of already begun to do in low Earth orbit, which is to maintain a continuous presence on the moon, in low Earth orbit with the International Space Station, which of course we'll get to. So the Artemis Accords are basically the sort of guidelines that you agree to before you can join the Artemis program. And in fact, Ecuador became the 26th country to join the Artemis Accords on June 21st, very right before the Indian announcement. So India's either country number 26 or 27. It's not clear yet. It's also not clear if India's actually formally signed it, because typically it's the head of a space agency that signs it. But the Indian ISRO chief was not part of the delegation and so on. But anyway, in principle, what's important is that India is on board with Artemis. Now, what it might mean, for India is unclear at the moment, because India's lunar program, while it's impressive, its budgets are really low, right? So if India wants to be part of the Artemis program, so for example, we look at JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, or the European Space Agency, ESA, they are involved in fairly complex and ambitious projects in the Artemis program, right? So, for example, they're helping build the various components of the Lunar Gateway. So the Lunar Gateway is the small space station that's supposed to be, in orbit around the moon, providing support and also be a sort of jumping off point for the moon. Then there's, a lunar base that's being planned. And there's also a constellation of communication and navigation satellites, uncrewed probes. The Europeans are designing and building a cargo ferry, basically, between the Earth and the moon. So these are all very complex and ambitious projects, and they're also expensive. And for India to do anything on the scale, and if a country like India would want to do something significant, you're going to have a large hike in your space budget. Where that money is going to come from, I'll leave to the public finance experts. But if you want to be a meaningful part of the Artemis program, you are going to have to spend a lot more money. Now, I should say that it makes no sense for India to just go to the moon by itself. one of the advantages of having friends is that you can do these things with others and learn from them, right? I mean, this is the handicap that China has. I don't know why we'd want to give ourselves that handicap, right? It makes no sense to me. So you should learn from others. You should collaborate with others. Sure, of course, you should build your own capabilities, but that's something you can do by learning and collaborating with others. And so in that sense, it's a great step forward. But where the money is going to come from is something that the Prime Minister is going to have to figure out when he gets back here. Now, NASA seems to have agreed to train more than one Indian astronaut. So earlier this year in what was the ISET agreement, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, NASA had agreed to train one Indian astronaut at the Johnson Space Flight Center. Now it seems that they're going to train more than one. I'm not quite clear yet. We should wait for more details. But and then they're also talking about a mission in 2024 to the International Space Station. Now, what would that mission be? I don't know. So there are countries that are already part of the International Space Station, and all of them contribute something, right? So they contribute a module, or Canada contributes a robotic arm. So all of them have some contribution to it. Now, the International Space Station is already really old, and it's going to end its service life in 2030. They might extend it by a year or so, but that's really the end of the International Space Station has perhaps 7, maybe 8 years left. So it doesn't make any sense for India to go and build a module for it. If India wants to do that sort of international collaboration, it should look at the sort of private or commercial space stations that America is actually encouraging to go up into low Earth orbit in the next 5 to 10 years. So, that's where the opportunities for the future lie. So the question is, what is this mission in 2024? Given that we're talking about astronaut training, most likely it is about sending an Indian astronaut or Vyomnaut, whatever we wish to call them, to the International Space Station. This person will probably go on a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, launch from the United States, dock on the International Space Station, perhaps do some experiments, maybe have a video call with the Prime Minister, sort of like Rakesh Sharma did with Indira Gandhi in 1984. So, that it's good optics, right? All politicians love this stuff. So, that's probably what it's going to mean. It's probably going to be a symbolic act, of showing enduring ties between India and the United States, but also, other partner states in the International Space Station. Yes, those are the two big ones. There are other, India and the US are working on some other things, scientific, which are basically have scientific application, for example, detecting gravitational waves. They continue to show their commitment to the NISAR satellite, which is a very ambitious and expensive satellite that India is going to launch, which has been built by both countries. That's its big USPs, being able to track various aspects of climate change, though it could also have some strategic applications.
Yeah, I mean, these are, obviously quite exciting developments, especially the fact that, India has finally signed Artemis Accords. And then it will be interesting to see what shape exactly this joint NASA-ISRO mission to the ISS is next year. So, Aditya, how ready, India is in terms of its regulatory approaches, its infrastructure, and you also already did highlight about funding. So these are very promising agreements, and then if they are exploited or let's say used well, they could really reap a significant benefit to the Indian space industry, the space science, everything. So how ready are we? And are there any risks or gaps that you would say we need to fill urgently to extract the best out of this opportunity?
Sure, yeah. So Artemis is going to have, both the state-to-state component, but as well as, the parts that involve private enterprise. Now, there's also in January, India and the US had agreed to collaborate on something called CLPS, which is not quite Artemis, but is connected to it. With CLPS is Commercial Lunar Payload Services. Basically, you can buy a slot on a ferry to the moon for your scientific or technological payload, not for people. So, you could put a rover there, you could put a science experiment there and stuff like that. So far, I don't think we've seen any Indian interest. I think we would have seen more Indian interest if our scientific labs were better funded, and also if our own space companies, were further along in the value chain. To get there, India is going to have to, what remains to be done with the regulatory architecture. We've seen the step of the Indian space policy coming into place in April, and there's a lot of good stuff about it. It has a very expansive definition of, what the private sector can do. That's all terrific. But really, if you want regulatory clarity, you are going to have to figure out exactly who the regulators are going to be. You're going to have to do a separation between the Department of Space and the regulators. And realistically, Saurabh, you're going to need a law. Look, Indian politicians don't like laws because legislative processes are arduous. You have to argue with the opposition and all that. But you need a law because you need a legal basis for a regulator to operate. This is just like with, for example, TRAI and TDSAT with the telecom sector. For that sector to take off, you are going to need laws and independent regulators. And I think that unless that happens, we're not in general we're going to see at least some hesitation to invest in the long term in India's private space sector. And, sending out, for example, satellites into low Earth orbit are risky enough, but sending payloads to the moon is an even bigger task, right? And you need to have that clarity over here in India about regulation, about liability and all these things before companies are going to be willing to spend the kind of money needed to go to the moon.
Yeah, plus, if it's policy, it is easily changed. Like, it can be changed, and it's flexible in a way that it is flexible to the whims and fancies of the people in charge. But if it's a law, it provides a much more concrete structure, which I think the companies, investors, everyone can bank on and see, okay, this is the basic structure that is, and then anything that will happen will be, at least around this structure. So thanks a lot, Aditya. This is exciting. I'm sure we'll talk again regarding these developments as they take shape. Hopefully they take shape faster. Given our history, I am cautiously optimistic, but let's see how this evolves.
Yep, looking forward to it.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.